Good morning and welcome to the webcast. This is our first session for the virtual 2020 Building Opportunity Conference from Moss Adams, providing insight into current challenges facing companies operating in the built world. Over the next few weeks, we will be hosting several sessions covering topics such as how COVID-19 is shaping the landscape of cities and infrastructure, economic impacts of newly passed bills, business planning in an election year, and post-election tax planning and considerations. More information for each session, including registration, are available in the links provided in your resources widget here on On24, as well as on mossadams.com. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
Thank you. And now, to get this year's conference started, we have our fascinating first session on the topic of COVID-19's implications for cities. I am pleased to introduce both today's host, Elaine Irvin, partner and national practice leader for construction here at Moss Adams, as well as our special guest presenter, Greg Lindsay, director of applied research at NewCities. Let's turn things over to Elaine to get us started. Elaine, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gerald. And welcome. We're so pleased to have you join us today. I'm really excited about this next presentation. I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating. Just a little background. Greg Lindsay is a journalist, urbanist, futurist, and a speaker. Obviously, he's here today. He is the director of applied research at NewCities and the director of strategy at its mobility offshoot Commotion. You know, I really encourage you to go in and read Greg's bio. But one of the things that I found the most interesting about his bio is that Greg is a 2-time Jeopardy champion. I went from not even knowing somebody on Jeopardy to knowing somebody that's a 2-time champion and the only human to go undefeated against IBM's Watson. So I take that as a good challenge for all of you to ask him many questions during this session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg. And Greg, we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Thank you all so much for joining. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon here in Montreal. I just want to note at housekeeping at the outset, we're going to have polls scattered throughout, as you saw. Feel free to ask questions into the Q&A throughout the presentation, and I'll try to basically, in the interest of time, pick up your questions as we go and wait for the poll results. Because we have a lot to cover today, and I will take you through a lot. So what I'm going to talk about today is definitely not investment advice. I love that disclaimer at the beginning, but I am going to introduce you to, I think, a lot of the trends that I've been observing in my work at NewCities and beyond about sort of how things are changing post-COVID under our feet as we speak. And I want to introduce you to, I think, to some of the big trends about how we'll sort of see cities transform themselves. But as a way, I guess, of starting off here, I've been thinking a lot these days about Robert Frost's poem, Fire and Ice. Some say the world will end in fire, he wrote, some say in ice. And I think about this, of course, in the context of climate change as the fire, ice as the economic fallout from the quarantines and caught between the two. But from what I've seen, obviously, with what's happening in the United States right now, from what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. And this, of course, has implications beyond, obviously, just infection rates and the economy as a whole, but obviously sort of what's happening with climate change and more broadly what's happening in the built environment. There was a paper in Nature in April that noted that, yes, that basically we, in the single stroke of legality, we were able to cut global carbon emissions by 17%. That was the good news. The bad news, of course, is that we had to temporarily destroy 40% of GDP to do it, which also underscores in a way that, that in our individual actions to reduce our carbon footprints don't matter in the end, or they matter much less than many of the structural impediments that are there. And, in this graph attached to that paper, you can see in the upper left is surface transportation is perhaps the biggest lever that we have to remake the world. And I think that's particularly interesting given that, that rather than using surface transportation to reduce our emissions, instead, over the last decade, simply the shift from cars to light trucks and SUVs is, according to the International Energy Agency, the second largest source of global carbon emissions, ahead of air travel, ahead of heavy industry. The only thing it trailed was power generation. So you can see that our decisions, how we build the world, how we move through it, have incredibly stark implications for it. And I bring this up in part because the fears, of course, of contagion have pushed us off public transportation into our cars. There are effects here that if we choose to avoid the ice of contagion and lockdown, we may be inadvertently choosing literally the fires that have swept out west this summer. And of course, there are economic consequences for our cities as well. And I've been thinking about this a lot during the boom in delivery, the whole sort of shift to our sort of lives indoors. And I think about this in the context of what was all the trends that were already underway. You're seeing a graph right here, for example. This is statistical data showing the change in storefronts in our cities over almost 30 years. And you can see, of course, that e-commerce had already eaten its way into newsstands and books and hardware, but that a growth in restaurants and face-to-face services like nail salons and pet care had propped up our cities. Those, of course, are exactly the services that we have not been engaging in during the pandemic. And of course, this leading to statistics like the fact that nearly half of all small businesses in New York City could fail during this year. So, huge implications for thinking this through. And this, of course, will ripple outward as new technologies come into play. And that's what we'll talk a bit about today. This is a graph, for example, showing or arguing, I should say, what the economic implications of cities could be for autonomous vehicles. Will we, if we have a world of AVs, will they be centripetal, pulling us into cities deeper and denser with all sorts of services to cater to our every whim, or will they be centrifugal, propelling us outward into the countryside, where autonomous vehicles could, in theory, give us 2-hour commutes seamlessly to our offices? But now, of course, with the pandemic, the entire notion of whether we will ever commute again is in doubt. And so with that, I want to put out my first sort of premise here, which we'll get to in the poll question. The sort of conventional wisdom that has been percolating throughout the pandemic. 3 assertions. The first is that, of course, is that cities are done, right? The COVID flight that we've seen out of the Bay Area and out of New York. I was a New Yorker for 20 years, and I'm watching the various headlines pile up here about the people fleeing from the large coastal metros that, of course, have been the economic engines of the United States. I believe there was an interesting Brookings report that came out last year, for example, that just 14 counties in the United States had generated 90% of what they described as innovation jobs. And you can imagine what those counties are. Counties in New York, San Francisco, Seattle, to a lesser extent, Portland and Washington, D.C., but these magnets for high technology and other jobs. Well, those people who occupied those counties are leaving to an extent. And here they've mapped, this is the New York Times mapping New York data, seeing, this flight to Florida, which we'll come back to as sort of, climate change. I keep thinking about those people fleeing from one disaster to another, potentially a more slow motion one. But you can see, this continued flight to the Sun Belt. And I just published a report yesterday about the Millennial Generation and where they will move to raise their families. Millennials, of course, are entering their 30s. Their oldest members turn 40 in just a few months. And, this is a generation that has gone through 2 financial crises. So where will they move to raise their kids? And this is the big debate that's happening right now. I think part of what we're seeing of people leaving cities is a lot of millennials accelerating their plans. People who are always going to leave these dense metros for larger homes in the Sun Belt are doing it faster. And so, it's interesting to follow the rhetoric between Redfin and Zillow, of course, based on the data they're seeing. The Redfin has been bullish from the beginning that we will see a COVID flight, that people are searching for cabins by the woods and remote valleys, that remote work will, of course, propel this. Zillow is a little bit more a suspect, though. Although, interestingly, their data shows that people are reevaluating their lives all the time. There's no obvious bias for one form of urban density over another, but basically people are investigating the opposite of the lives they live now in terms of their searches. And this has been true throughout the pandemic. My wife, actually, Sophie Donaldson, published this op-ed in the New York Times early on in the pandemic. She's the former editor-in-chief of House Beautiful, so this is actually a bit of a stylized version of our own home, and I imagine it's very recognizable to many of you this far in. But yes, this notion of how we thought about our homes and how home design will change during the pandemic is one of the first aspects of this. Now that we've moved all of our lives to the interior, it shouldn't come to no surprise that the data is bearing out that people are buying the largest homes they possibly can while keeping as many as the amenities as they can. We just did this ourselves. We just purchased the largest home of our entire life here in Montreal, trying to sort of wed between these 2 trends. And you can sort of see there's already sort of interesting implications. I wonder about how some of these will pan out, whether these will end up being some of the speculative post-9/11 ideas that, for example, that no one would ever work in a skyscraper again. But here's Andreas Duany, famous as a founder of the New Urbanism, already designing apartments that have built-in sort of mudrooms for decontamination and open plan flooring with utility rooms that allow you to set up home Zoom studios. This is an existing plan. You're probably familiar with Lennar's NextGen. This one comes up because it was designed expressly for millennial families with apartments built inside to cater to perhaps, older parents, intergenerational living for childcare purposes, or you could just put it up on Airbnb to help make your mortgage payments. And we've seen, of course, that the other reaction to this has been renewed growth in, the so-called, invitation homes and American homes for rent, the companies that want you to rent forever, as I call them. These are the companies that were formed out of the foreclosure crisis 12 years ago that are now basically reinvesting in buying single-family homes and turning them into permanent asset class of rentals. Blackstone, which got out of the game with invitation homes after $7 billion, just got back into it with an investment in Tricon. So we're seeing them push as well. And, the other big, implication of this for millennials and others that I think about this in terms of where people will move and how they will sort of seek to rearrange their lives is that a half of all childcare spots for preschool age children are in danger of vanishing. This is a report from the spring by the Center for American Progress, estimating a huge drop. So one of my recommendations actually to the next administration is nationalize daycare. If there's one thing we've seen in this country, it's that, it's hard to be a working parent when your children are underfoot constantly. So I think, it'll be interesting to see what policies the next administration chooses to put in place to support people like this, but also, again, these lifestyle choices. Because, of course, they've been very unequal throughout all of this. You've probably heard of the so-called K-shaped recovery. This was actually coined on Twitter, in finance Twitter, but you know that economists love to basically name recoveries after the shapes of various letters. And K-shape refers to, yes, the fact that the inequality that was baked into American society is now veering wider than ever. We're seeing, for example, that homeownership rates are exploding. I think mortgage applications are up 20% according to the last set of Freddie Mac data. Why? I mean, obviously low interest rates from the Fed that allowed those who are able to buy are now buying in droves. And refinancing is up 40% year over year, not just against pre-pandemic levels. So, again, for the rich are getting richer and the home rich are getting richer, I suppose, too. But, this is also leading to changes in mobility as well in terms of, thinking about where people are buying and how this will lead to changes. It's probably also no secret that, one of the biggest tragedies, I think, of the pandemic overall was the early fears that, that basically public transportation, being in public alone, would be a super spreading event, right? You remember probably washing your groceries with bleach when we thought that, the virus would persist on things we touched for long periods of time. Well, of course, that led to people abandoning mass transit in cities like Seattle, San Francisco, in Los Angeles. Driving and to an extent walking and cycling have recovered, and we'll talk a bit about that. But that mass abandonment of public transportation for private vehicles will, of course, have effects. And we're seeing various around the world try to basically sort of make the best of a bad situation and use this as an opportunity to rethink the structures of our cities. One of the trendiest ideas out there and most hopeful is being adopted in Paris. Mayor Anne Hidalgo, who was reelected this summer on a pre-pandemic promise to remake Paris as the 15-minute city. And this is the idea that, particularly in an era of remote work, the boundaries of your life would be a 15-minute walk or bicycle ride to the edge and back. And then within that 15 minutes, you should have everything you need to live your life. All the amenities, all the groceries, the childcare, the opportunities to live, work, and play. And this is something that her administration is setting out to do by closing streets to cars and basically sort of remaking central Paris. Now, this is, of course, an interesting exercise, if you are, a dense city, like in this case, New York, and this is in Brooklyn, of course, in Brownstone, Brooklyn, where, programs like across the country to do slow streets and close streets to traffic to create space for social distancing have proven so popular everywhere. But, it raises some more interesting questions, too, about, how do we remake our cities and our suburbs to provide the amenities that are missing already? How do we better utilize the space that's there? And it's led to some really interesting rethinkings about what we'd always taken for granted about, right, that streets were just for cars, or that was the most productive space, was to take the center of our cities and give all that laneage to cars. Here, for example, this is in Flushing, New York, one of the largest Koreatowns in America, where, the restaurants have basically built entire wood pavilions outside with elaborate seating. And I think it's interesting there that, that you can see a scooter parked outside. That's how he arrived. And, we're seeing cities like Paris and Milan, Montreal here, and this is the mayor of Bogota, Mayor Carmen Hernandez, who has vowed that she wants in the future that 50% of all trips in the city should be made by bicycle. That's really remarkable because Copenhagen, which is the gold standard of this, is less than 40%. So this idea that we're all going to switch en masse, where the weather allows at least, into these forms of mobility is really interesting. And again, where it intersects with technology is fascinating. These are autonomous scooters currently deployed in exurban Atlanta right now. This is by a company called Tortoise. So we'll touch a bit upon some of this in a bit. But, the idea that, that we could remake our streets for mobility and we could have devices that reposition themselves waiting to pick up passengers is increasingly becoming a reality. And, in reaction to this, this value that can be unlocked from our cities and streets as people move off of public transport and hopefully, move out of cars, to lessen the carbon emissions and lessen traffic as we see gridlock spiking. We're seeing cities like LA are actually inventing new tools and new software to basically monitor what's happening in their streets and also understand the value of what it could be. So in this slide we're looking at, this is the LA DOT Mobility Data Specification. It's a mouthful, but it's really interesting to me because as far as I can tell, it's the first example of a city writing its own software specification. This is what LA designed. It was going to be used for autonomous vehicles at some point in the future, but they rolled it out when scooters started appearing. And it allows them to receive information from scooters, where they are they charged, are they lying on a sidewalk somewhere, or are they parked responsibly, et cetera, et cetera. But it also allows them to push information as well, how fast you can go, where you can go, what you're allowed to do. And so, Selita Reynolds, who's the general manager of LADOT, likes to say that code is the new concrete. That we're going to start to see cities govern themselves in software and these so-called digital twins as much as they do by street signage. And this will allow, all sorts of interesting implications in the future as cities step in trying to now tame this traffic which threatens to overwhelm them as people abandon mass transit. So this is a startup that I worked with in Brooklyn at Urbanize, which is BMW Mini's tech accelerator, called ClearRoad. And they basically use onboard software and GPS to allow you to do mileage-based pricing wherever you are. So you don't need to do a congestion zone. You can just literally toll people for moving through the world. They also imagine that someday you could divide up streets, as Seattle and others have done, in terms of usage. You could create invisible lanes that allow them to sort out and charge accordingly, so that cities can really capture this usage. Other cities are working with startups like Cord out of Sidewalk Labs to basically define their curb space. So taking every square inch of curb and turning that into a digital map with permissions and tolls attached to it to basically account for the fact, as we'll see in a little bit here, the massive explosion in e-commerce that is happening that is already overwhelming both the U.S. Postal Service and UPS and FedEx, but also even Amazon's internal capacity for this kind of e-commerce. So we're seeing cities desperately try to turn to these digital tools to help manage it. And then in the future, we can start to imagine how they'll remake cities here when we emerge on the other side of a vaccine, when we realize the opportunities that we have and what we can think of, we'll have new tools in place to basically turn these assets to something more productive. This is a project that I worked on a few years ago with the architecture firm Woods Bagot out of Australia, where they use their software to map, in this case, I guess I'll go back for a sec, every available surface level city-owned parking space in downtown Los Angeles. And what they then imagine is you could a tool that allowed you to sort of play with urban density, to change the zoning envelopes and imagine what you could build there. And so they also propose prototypes. Here's rethinking what courtyard apartments could be if you basically abolished parking minimums, as Portland has done, as Seattle has done in certain areas, and as San Francisco has done. Rethinking downtown infill, what kind of calculations could you make to create new mixed-use projects in already the dense downtown areas, or thinking about how you could tear out strip parking along the sides of roads and create these new kinds of boulevards. Now, of course, how we get the retail formulas and others to work on the post-COVID real estate is something they didn't account for at the time, but it does point to rethinking about, we have incredible assets in our cities that, we can generate all new forms of value that we're just beginning to figure out how to evaluate. And we're just beginning to change the laws as well in this. Two more in this section, and then get ready for the first poll. Portland this summer changed its zoning code, what's been described as the most progressive zoning in the United States, to allow landowners to build 2 houses or even 3 houses on the parcels that would have been a single-family home, what's been called missing middle housing. This kind of gentle density that would allow more families to stay in basically some of the most desirable neighborhoods, and then add to foot traffic and allow basically new forms of businesses to flourish. That's what Portland has done amidst, of course, a very tumultuous summer, and followed in the footsteps of Minneapolis, which is the first city to do that. And then that would allow projects like this. This is Cul-de-sac. This is a new development that's being built in Tempe, Arizona, next to the Arizona State University campus. It's a brand new set of developers coming out of the dot-com world. And basically they're imagining, 1,000 units of basically dense, almost co-living properties aimed at young people, post-collegiate. But there they've taken all the space that would have been dedicated to parking and turned it over to food trucks, other amenities, but also on-site micromobility parking, and thinking through all the sort of new calculus that I described there. So these are the kinds of new development formulas that I think we're going to see on the other side of the pandemic, which will make city life, again, perhaps much more attractive to, at the very least, the young people who stay behind. So with that brings us to our first poll here. Are cities done? And I would say these polls are more whimsical and to test the temperature of the audience than anything else. But, are you calling the movers as we speak, planning to leave? If you're going to leave anyway, now's the time. Do you think this is simply the moment that those who are making up their minds are headed out the door? Are you staying put for now? Or did you, like me, just buy a house at 2% interest? Canadian interest rates, what can I tell you? So we'll wait for you to fill those in here. I've got some great questions already coming in. So if I can just get this here in place.
Sure.
When you talk about
While you look at the questions, Greg, sorry to interrupt. Yeah. As a reminder for the audience, please click on your answer and then hit the submit button. Very important, hit the submit button once you've selected your answer for it to count. You'll need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions for CPE credit today. Thank you, Greg. Please continue.
Thank you. Adam Pinsky has a great question here. When you talk about cities, can you define that more? What is a city? Population size, geographic size? Thanks. I guess I would say in that sense, I would look at the metro area, because one of the things, and we'll cover this in the work section next, is the best definition of city I've seen is by Elaine Berteau, an economist, who argues that basically cities are essentially job sheds, right? The ability to live at any point in a city and travel to another point to work really functionally defines the size of a city. If you can't do that, if it's too long a commute or the traffic's too tight, you functionally broke it apart into other various cities. So yeah, these huge metropolitan areas, the Bay Area, Los Angeles, some of the big ones here. And one of the questions we'll get to with remote work is, has remote work shattered that paradigm where now you can effectively live at any sort of scale of life, from utterly rural to utterly dense urban, and still participate in those job sheds? So we'll cover that in just a moment here. Someone had, Vanessa, can't leave California fast enough. We'll cover that in the climate change. People leaving the Bay Area for Napa Valley and Sonoma now headed back because driven by the fires or the Sierra Nevada. So there's some really interesting implications about that. And we're waiting almost for the results to come in. When it comes to vehicles, I often hear the argument, this is by John Baxley, that the only way to realistically reduce vehicle ownership and usage is through de-incentivizing people through tolls and taxes. Do you agree with this, or do you see positive reinforcement methods beginning to develop? I guess the answer to that one is going to be all of the above. I do think you're going to need tolls and taxes. We're going to need to address what happens to the gas tax in a world of electrified vehicles. Obviously, California mandating no more sales of internal combustion engines by 2035. But I also think there's going to be great opportunities there for demand management, for creating loyalty programs for mass transit and other things that will incentivize people with carrots instead of just sticks. But we'll cover that, I think, a little bit more. But it's good to see here that people are not pulling the plug on the city yet, although perhaps some of the California residents in this are that 8%. But more than half of you are planning to stay put, and it'll be interesting to see whether you follow the ways of millennials as well. So that's great. Let's move on here. I hope my moire pattern on my shirt up there isn't as bad as it looks on my screen. The office is dead. Our second thing, this gets, of course, to one of the biggest debates about what's happening here, is, basically the sort of post office shift in work going to last forever. And it's been really interesting, sort of how far we pushed that trend in the opposite direction until the pandemic. This, of course, is Facebook headquarters. This is the Facebook newsfeed team, the core of the entire enterprise inside of Frank Gehry's massive hangar, the world's largest open plan office, arguably. And, every time I would look at this image, I would always think of this guy, right? Like, this is how most people felt inside these open plan offices. Extroverts only want it here. And of course, we've taken that to the opposite world where now we basically live on Zoom. And I love the fact that we now have services where you can hire farms to put goats into your sort of Zoom meetings there. So, we're now living in a world where we only interpret that. And again, go back to the K-shaped recovery, you can sort of see here some of the trends that we've adopted here when it comes to standing desks and other sort of, workplace trends and the sartorial equivalent of mullets, right? But, I'm very skeptical about some of these trends and where and how this was motivated. For years, I actually talked to CEOs of companies and the shared workspace, corporates like WeWork and others, who told me, of course, that the shift to open plan offices and whatnot was driven by this need for serendipity and casual encounters and all of this. And really, in the end, it was about to cut real estate costs. So now when I see bank CEOs and others saying that, that we don't need offices anymore, and I see British Petroleum rush to sell its headquarters in London for £300 million, I wonder what their motivations actually are, about whether this is a quality of life for us, their employees, or whether this is really about making you internalize their real estate costs. And then you also have companies like Airbnb, of course, which is argued Brian Chesky has quickly pivoted from, basically the notion that Airbnb exists to bring people to the most attractive cities in the world, Venice, Barcelona, but now as a place to allow you to work not just from home, but from someone else's home. That work from anywhere is going to increasingly become the norm. And the reason I'm skeptical of this, of course, is that this is a great solution for those of us who are wealthy enough and have the agency to do it. We've seen, obviously, the studies show that remote work correlates highly with your income. There's an estimate that 37% of all jobs in the United States could be done remotely. But what about the other 2/3 of essential workers who are, of course, struggling in California right now? There's the huge Uber and Lyft funded ballot measure to basically deny full-time benefits to gig workers, and sort of how we see these essential workers. Because this has been, of course, the state, I think, of many of us, this incredible compression of work and family all into the same place. And, the rising levels of mental burnout we're already starting to see in various workplaces here. Incredible productivity, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, but at what cost as we've depleted our surge capacities. And the other thing I think about in this, which is been under-discussed, this is the work of Richard Baldwin, the economist, who refers to the term remote intelligence. We worry about, and I'll come to this in a moment, about the AIs taking our jobs. But really, for years, of course, we've seen, a 50-year legacy of offshoring jobs, moving supply chains offshore to China and whatnot. We, of course, we have call centers go to India, and now, of course, the Philippines and elsewhere. But if we move to a work where effectively, knowledge work can be done remotely, invisibly to some extent, what happens to the organization as we know it? Because I won't belabor this too much, but if you look at the work of Ronald Coase, the economist who won the Nobel Prize for the nature of the firm, Coase argued that the reason you have large vertically integrated firms is because it's very hard to find people, negotiate with them, and monitor them to do the work. If those costs are very cheap, then organizations fly apart. And I start to think about, will organizations even have employees in the future? Do we all end up as contractual white-collar gig workers? And what does that actually mean? And then, of course, you bring artificial intelligence into this. So I promise we didn't mention Jeopardy just because because it's the best thing I've accomplished in my life, but also I have looked Watson in the eye as an AI and have thought about the implications of what Watson and AI means for work. And as I mentioned here, obviously these fears of the robots will come take our jobs. And I've written and talked to a number of economists about, how much we have to fear from that. And it's interesting. It's a very nuanced question because according to James Beston at Boston University, a software entrepreneur himself, he's argued that when you look at past technologies that have burst onto the scene, new technologies that are designed to increase worker productivity lead to an explosion in new jobs and economic output, right? It makes things that were formerly hard to do very cheap, which then leads to pent-up latent demand explode and creates new industries, et cetera, et cetera. And then only later, when those industries are mature, then eventually it destroys jobs through automation because they're old at that point. They can be rationalized. But that's sort of not what's happening this time around. The technologies are being deployed very differently. This, for example, is an experiment by the Institute for the Future's Devin Fidler, where it created an iCEO, and they gave the CEO a job to release a research paper. Well, what it did was it went to those remote work platforms like Upwork and WorkMarket that I just referred to and hired dozens of humans out of sight below the API, as they say, and had them basically crowdsource writing, researching, editing the whole paper, and then present it. The AI, it seemed like the AI did it, but really it was a bunch of low-cost humans behind it. And this is, of course, a whole term of art in AI research. The classic notion of the mechanical Turk, the Turkish sultan who designed his chess-playing automaton that seemed like a mechanical marvel, but was really a very small chess grandmaster hiding inside. We call this today photomation or Potemkin AI, the notion that AI will be used to basically destroy wages and destroy worker jobs. And we're sort of seeing how this is deployed here. Walmart, of course, using robots to sweep its shelves, or Amazon, basically sort of, adopting this automation for its warehouses and soon to be delivery here. And you can see in their patent portfolio, Amazon actually has these sort of AR goggles here that would literally give turn-by-turn directions to the workers in its warehouses, basically not helping workers become better at their jobs, but turning them to be more like machines. And I bring this up because Darren Acemoglu at MIT, has raised the question about particularly what's happening again during the pandemic with the rush to contactless, to touchless, to, shifting towards these automated solutions. Darren Acemoglu asked, is this the wrong kind of AI? Is this AI being used to increase productivity, or is it being used to destroy labor? And increasingly, the answer appears to be it's being used to destroy labor. And so this is the kind of wrong kind of AI I'm thinking about. And I think about this. This is a tweet that appeared the day after the U.S. presidential election in 2016. And I've thought about it often. You can see here it's a combination of maps showing the number of truck drivers by state, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, when we're all going to have autonomous trucks. They're still coming, but they're not here yet. And then mapping that against, of course, the Electoral College. The implication here being, if you think the economic anxiety of Trump voters is bad in 2016, what happens to an electorate that is increasingly dispossessed by automation that is used to destroy jobs? And, this is not just speculative rando on Twitter. Brookings went back and also looked at sort of the political breakdown of states vulnerable to automation. Of course, out west, you can see the various states there with their high concentration of knowledge workers in better shape than many of the places in the heartland. The question is to be done. What is to be done with this? Bill Gates and a handful of others have called for taxing the robots, and sort of people sort of smirk and move on from this. But this proposal was actually more seriously suggested by MIT's task force on this, led by David Autor and Elizabeth Reynolds, where they pointed out that, yes, our tax code basically massively subsidizes investments in software and equipment and not so much in labor. So there are hard economic incentives for employers and to basically invest in this kind of wrong kind of AI rather than use it to empower their workers still. So that is something from a policy and tax standpoint I think we need to think about. For those of us who will go back to offices, assuming that day comes, I'm confident that it will, I think we're going to see a lot more think what happens inside of it. The notion of the office as a place to do work is as a container for doing work, I thought was always sort of crazy. If you think about it, going, it feels crazy today, going to the same place every day to do everything, everything you have to do, no matter what mood you're in or no matter what style of work you need to do, is on its face a little strange. So perhaps we'll see, a wider variety of workspaces and styles and offices designed for more collaboration. And I bring this up. This is Bill Hewlett and William Packard, who famously managed, the foundation of Silicon Valley, by management by walking around, as they called it. And it was sort of interesting because their successor, one of the things that Hewlett Packard did, what made it an industrial titan, it was very good at cross-pollinating all sorts of different fields. It was very good at bringing workers together from various areas in this sort of fruitful collaboration, which is something they lost, and most organizations have lost. Their successor, famously bemoaned here, if HP knew what HP knows, we'd be 3 times more productive. Well, he said that, and then he sold off the scientific instruments division that was the source of their productivity, and then he retired. So he copped out of that. But I think there's some interesting stuff that's going to happen in offices where all the sensors and all the surveillance that's going to be adopted here for health could also be retasked in terms of knowing who is there and why. And this is something I followed for years. MIT's Humanize, a spinoff from the MIT Media Lab, developed this sociometric badge that measures and monitors who you're speaking to, where you are going, who you're talking to, all these sorts of very minute things. And the scariest part about it is that even though it's recording everything you're saying, it doesn't care. It doesn't actually listen to the content of your speech. What it cares about is your interaction patterns, how you talk to others and what it means. Because from this, you can actually sort of map out what effectively organizations look like and who the most important people are. And I think this is exactly the kind of technology that's been nascently brewing, but we're going to see these sort of more instrumented organizations, which arguably become necessary if we see them start to spread out into the world, knowing where your employees are, knowing who they're talking to, will become more important. And it also means that work as a workspace, as a category, is going to change and disperse. The notion of offices as a category type, I think, will radically transform. And things like WeWork, which was a laughing stock on the edge of the pandemic, of course, and on the brink of falling apart, now their new management is confident that they will return to profitability next year, in part because they expect their business to increasingly be based on enterprise customers who will dump their own corporate holdings and sell off the buildings and invest in moment-to-moment research, or moment-to-moment, sort of lease-to-lease office space. So, and then we'll also see, this typology start to spread elsewhere. We've already seen, for example, Westfield in San Francisco tore out the department stores in its flagship mall on Market Street and put in its own branded co-working space. We've seen in the suburbs of Boston, basically WorkBar partner with Staples to start dropping in offices into the middle of underpopulated big box stores. So, for those of us who do move to the suburbs, or those of us who do stick closer to home, we could see as part of these 15-minute cities, going to the nearest big box store or nearest coffee shop turned this, or nearest mall that has been converted to tech offices and turned into that. So I think, where we do work and how we do it is out to be changed as well. So with that, we're at our next poll here, and this gets to, again, another temperature-taking exercise. Is the office dead? Number one, work from home forever, like you think we're never going back. Please, I have children. This is the state I am in, but the office did serve a very useful function to allow me to divide from the rest of my life so I could focus on work. C, only Mondays and Fridays. This notion of the 3+2 or 4+1 work week, where we'll see it become standard policy that we'll be able to increasingly work from home, but we'll still have a centered office life. And finally, it's fine, the robot can take my job, thinking that, yes, the days of automation burrowing into white-collar work maybe sooner than we think. So while we take that, I'll try to take a few more questions here. We've got some more. Let's see. We've got one. Let's see. Vanessa has one. I believe labor laws and bargaining units will need to drastically change their models in municipalities and other companies for the new world normal to work. So many variabilities here. I feel strongly these are old, antiquated labor models that won't work moving forward. Totally agree with you on this. And there's been governments around the world that are being very progressive on this. Spain has already passed remote labor, basically a set of protections for remote workers from home. I think, what's playing out in California will be very, very interesting to see, whether Uber and Lyft and the others funding ballot measure 22 managed to basically overturn AB 5 and try to create that. I mean, obviously there could be some good examples of that, of more flexible models, but I don't think that's what Uber and Lyft have in mind necessarily. Here in Canada, we've seen the Canada Labour Board here basically has won the right to organize postal workers and other sort of gig workers. So we're seeing these kinds of modified protections put in place because, yeah, I mean, I think, I think there definitely needs to be rethinking about, whether we should be receiving stipends for home offices or how the tax code should change to basically account for that. Obviously, home offices were already factored in, but if that becomes the norm, how will we sort of incorporate that? All right, well, good. I say a solid victory for only Mondays and Fridays here. So yes, believer here that we'll switch to this 3+2 model. I think that's a good policy overall. It will be interesting to see how we do this in terms of the fact that how organizations will manage themselves with virtual workflows so that you can continue to move processes along while people will come together face to face for tight-knit collaboration. There's a lot of interesting management challenges they're going to have to be met. All right, moving along here. We're making good time. Section delivery is the future here. Looking at some of the interesting retail models that have popped up here and when the ongoing death of retail, because yes, the mall apocalypse was already here and has now been massively accelerated. I remember a time when we all quoted the Credit Suisse report that said a quarter of all malls would be dead by 2024. A quarter of all malls might be dead this year alone. And then, of course, here's UBS, 75,000 stores to close by 2026, 25,000 stores closing this year. So, yes, the retail apocalypse is in full swing here. And, of course, we've seen, mall owners and others under incredible strain. It's been fascinating to watch, basically the real estate owners bail out their tenants by acquiring the likes of J.Crew and others as well in an attempt to keep that model propped up. But, there are already, again, structural changes that were afoot well ahead of this. The fact that, we saw a declining share of spending at stores, but increase at restaurants, bars, and takeout. This has been sort of fueling the pandemic trend as well of thinking about, all these deliveries of groceries and whatnot to our homes. And this was spawning already interesting, fascinating new types of real estate. I just attended the last 2 days a conference called Curbivore, which was particularly focused on all of the proprietors of these new so-called ghost restaurants, cloud kitchens, dark retail, which I'll show in a moment here. This, for example, this is Travis Kalanick, who co-founder of Uber, took his money and basically invested into what he's called these cloud kitchens, which is the notion of basically modular restaurant units dropped into dead malls and other underutilized assets to basically create facilities that only exist in terms of consumer presence on apps. Uber Eats, effectively did this by going to existing restaurants and encouraging them to launch multiple brands through its app out of the same kitchens as a way to basically increase trends, combining its data sets to see what ethnic cuisines are underestimated or underrepresented on its various platforms. So this larger trend, if you want to think about it, is we're seeing high streets basically melt down and dematerialize in real time, and they're beginning to rematerialize in different locations, in warehouses, out of sight, kind of thing like that. The various dark stores model, for example, which Amazon is pushing into, I'll show you in a moment there. But this is, thinking about what these sort of multi-use spaces will be. This was from a piece that imagined that, that basically every new sort of small business in the future will have to marry a sort of select, if it's a restaurant, for example, will have to marry a selection of retail, perhaps selling its wines and others, with a robust takeout business, with the core of its facility set aside for production and prep rather than seating, perhaps. All of these new permutations that are still trickling through. And one of the founders of Curveball, this is Matt Newberg, founder of Hungry, runs a great newsletter on all these sorts of trends. Interestingly enough, he went undercover as an Amazon Fresh delivery. Amazon Fresh is the new grocery store format that's launched in Los Angeles here. And in several days of delivering groceries on behalf of Amazon, he noticed that Amazon had its own kind of 15-minute city. He noticed that basically he never went further than a mile radius from around its stores. So that, again, they were sort of dropping in these kinds of, it was mostly retail up front, but 20% of the facility was given to sort of this dark store delivery operation out of the back. And they were very mapping close to the various areas around them. So Amazon itself was thinking through, in a way, what a 15-minute city should look like. But that 15 minutes is the delivery time from its gig force workers to you in your home nearby. And this will only get more interesting and more weird when autonomy comes into play. Coming back to autonomous vehicles in this discussion. I think this is 6 years ago now. I moderated a fascinating conversation at the Googleplex in Mountain View, before Waymo existed, before Google really even commercialized its autonomous vehicle ambitions. And this was its captain of moonshots, Astor Teller, who gave this talk. And this is the line that sticks with me to this day. We might need self-driving buildings as well as self-driving cars. This notion that really, if you think about it, the self-driving SUV is the horseless carriage of autonomy. Autonomy is a set of capabilities and software and hardware that will trickle down into any number of hardware platforms, whether it's the self-driving scooters we saw earlier, or whether it's these increasing number of multi-purpose vehicles, which are increasingly accelerating adoption in China. I had the chief strategy officer of Neolix on a webinar earlier this summer, and talked about the fact that here, it's fumigating the streets in this particular mode. And here they shared some of the data basically on sort of how, violating all the laws of real estate, of location, and foot traffic, they're using basically data, and they're sending the vehicles to the people. The real estate is coming to them. The services are coming to them. And that, of course, is very interesting in terms of what it does to further undermine various retail models and what kind of services can be delivered to that. So, in Britain, we've seen Starship here, and they're sort of, very small bots using sidewalks in the famous Redways master plan town. It also brings us back to that conversation earlier about, if cities don't software map their streets and sidewalks, we might see them overwhelmed by various devices. But I'll wrap this section up in a moment here. But you have Neuro. Neuro is a startup here that was spun out of Waymo engineers. They've partnered with CVS to use it for various pharmaceutical deliveries, and they have permits to do, I think, almost 5,000 vehicles on the streets of Houston, for example. So I think one of the big post-COVID trends will be, incredible investment and permission coming from various municipalities to test out these contactless vehicles. And China is the wild, wild east when it comes to this. One thing I learned from talking to Neolix on that webinar is that they've partnered with Meituan, which is another one of the big delivery services, to create a contactless restaurant. So, imagine a sort of ghost restaurant of sorts where, or an automat, if you're old enough to remember that, of ordering off your own devices and food being delivered by robots. All sorts of, crazy different business models that are now being deployed. And then finally, for this, again, this is going to be increasingly Baroque, and I would encourage you to think about how weird this can get. Robin Chase, the founder of Zipcar, coined this acronym RATS for Retail Autonomous Traffic Services to describe all these different devices that will spread. And I paired it with this image. I don't know if you have this in the West, but in New York, union labor that was angry at their employers would deploy the inflatable rat outside to show a labor dispute. And I noticed it mounted in this truck. Right? There's nothing stopping autonomous vehicles from having all sorts of weird sculptural elements and flashing advertisements, imagining what a future of ads looks like as it moves and wends its way through cities. This is the kind of strange future that I think we might start to see in our bizarre contactless future. So with that, I think our next poll question here, how big do you want your life to be? Never leave the house. You're totally content with this world that we have. Stay at home and stay close to home. Or you want a 15-minute city, as in a 15-minute walk. working close to home and having most of your errands on foot. A 15-minute drive, perhaps more possible for many who live in a suburban environment, but again, never commuting to a CBD or an office on the fringe of a city, or from the fringe to the core of a city. And then D, can I have my old life back now? Like, you want to go back to the office and you want to go back to that commute. Many people do. The average American, I think, says that the perfect commute is 22 minutes long, not 0 minutes. There's something to be said about having that ability to disconnect. So let's see some other questions we have in here. I'll pick one. Stephen Ross has one. Is the movement to work from home policy a pendulum that will swing back? Interesting enough, I hopefully not. I think, for a lot of remote workers, I think, it becomes a question of what the amenity is, right? There's this great stat going around that, employers spend up to $20,000 per employee on outfitting an office and real estate costs. It'll be interesting to see, to what extent they give that money back. What if they gave every worker $20,000 and told them to outfit their home office the way they chose, or invest that in real estate? That would be a very interesting channeling of those subsidies. So I don't know if it goes that far. It'll be hard to see how they might unwind it. But I don't know. I think it's time for the pendulum to swing in that direction. Here we have UBI here. There's a discussion here about whether Andrew Yang was an alarmist for bringing up UBI here. Yes. There's a question. Do you believe UBI will soon become necessary? I'm a big believer in UBI. I'm a believer in the sense that we need to think of more cash payments and think of direct subsidies versus using it to sort of undermine the welfare state, as a number of academics. But interestingly enough, some of the biggest proponents of UBI in the country, in the United States, are actually mayors of basically communities of color. The mayor of Stockton, Mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, and others. There's actually an alliance now of mayors, mostly black mayors of mostly majority black American cities, that are calling for UBI as supplemental aid to their citizens. And they've been joined in California by Mayor Schaaf and Mayor Garcetti, I think the largest cities on that list. But it'll be interesting, to see how that gains momentum, and thinking about cash payments. Experiments in Finland and here in Canada, Ontario, have proven to be quite successful and not diminish people's need to work. So the poll question quickly here. An almost even split here between those of us who wish to go back to the old ways and commute to the center city, and the 15-minute drive. Interesting enough, I would put myself be here for the 15-minute walk. I like the notion of being able to go to a workspace nearby but stick close to home. But that is, of course, a real position of privilege. But I think, the 15-minute drive is the challenge that I highlighted in my report on millennials that came out yesterday. How do we urbanize America's suburbs, right? How do we take that urban fabric, which has a lot of amenities that people like, and add the pieces of cities that we like the most onto them? So that will be an interesting challenge. All right, we have 15 minutes left, so we've got one more section here, and then we'll finish it off with some questions. We're making some good ground. And the final one, of course, is our climate change section, Seek Higher Ground. I'm organizing a conference, first of its kind, on climate migration online, which I would encourage you all to register for. We can spread that out here. But of course, this was the situation this summer, across much of North America. The fires in the West spreading the equivalent of soot across almost the entire North American landmass. Multiple hurricanes churning in the Atlantic for the busiest storm season since 2005, only the second time they actually ran out of names. My oldest son is named Teddy. I held my breath seeing if Hurricane Teddy would be remembered the way that Katrina or Sandy is today. And of course, we've seen what's happening out west. You've probably lived through it here, that cities that are generally considered some of the most desirable to live in the United States and the world, Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, just across the border, all at one point held the title of the worst air quality on Earth at one point this summer. And those of you, of course, who live in San Francisco and the Bay Area do not need to be told about the eeriness of the orange cloud that settled across the land. That animation will play there. But yes, but in addition to those, which we think about, we're already starting to see other disasters play out. On August 10th, you may not have heard about this, but a massive storm system called a derecho, I'd never heard of it, swept across Iowa and Illinois, and basically caused massive damage across the Midwest there. And so I think of this in the sense of, we have a hint right now of what our future reality looks like, where we're seeing, disasters like a global pandemic, which of course is already stretching government capacity to the breaking point, is now actually, colliding with natural disasters like this. And so we're starting to see these spiraling feedback loops. This has led to some already unthinkable conversations. I first became aware of sort of the managed retreat discussion a few years ago. Susanna Drake, who just won a National Design Award from the Smithsonian, told me at the time that retreat was not in the American lexicon. We would never see that phrase. And yet this was the New York Times this summer as hurricanes, I forget, one of the hurricanes that made landfall, of course, along the Gulf Coast. There have been so many already. Here, we start on the front page of the New York Times thinking about a policy that goes back to the Obama administration and adopted by the Trump administration to start forcefully relocating people off the various coasts. And of course, there's a looming crisis when it comes to flood insurance. We're seeing, for example, in California, for example, already a movement by the insurers to basically make large swaths of Central and Northern California uninsurable as a way to protect themselves against the losses of what they see as foregone forest fire victims there. And, and then again, early this fall, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission put out a report that no uncertain terms warns of systemic financial risk to the entire U.S. economy and sub-systemic financial risk to real estate and other various sectors of that. And so basically calling for renewed regulation delving into this. And I'm currently talking to the Swiss Re Institute as an example of these insurers. We're thinking long and hard, for example, as you can see in these diagrams, about the various feedback loops and about how they can work with mayors to think about ways to basically, adopt higher levels of, basically sort of do a better job of mapping out this climate risk and designing new insurance products that would encourage them to basically invest in greater resilience and move out of high-risk areas, creating a sort of new financial carrot and stick mechanism that would compel these economies. And this is the kind of thing that we're going to be exploring at my conference this winter, actually. But thinking through what happens in the longer run as well about as the sort of habitable zone of North America begins to change. This was done by some maps by ProPublica and the New York Times this fall. Again, looking at how it has steadily moved northward and northwestward for those of you in the Pacific Northwest. I've seen literature for years arguing that that the Pacific Northwest would be a climate haven. I'm not sure they took all of the forest fires into effect when developing those models. But this is going to require not only a retreat away from the coast and moving away from high-risk areas, but it's going to require us to massively build in new areas as well and think about what these new communities will look like and where we'll build them. And, Susanna Drake and I was part of a team a few years ago to imagine the coasts of New York and New Jersey in 2067, 50 years out from 2017. And we imagined, amphibious architecture. We imagined, Jamaica Bay, where New York JFK is, thinking about new forms of housing. Some would be designed to flood. Some would be designed to harden against it. But really, we need to think also about how we incorporate resilience into the standard products that we build. It's been interesting to me to see that Tesla, which acquired its Solar City sister company providing solar panels, is now finally offering the product that it touted years ago here of imagining an integrated product where you have solar panels on your roof with your battery in the garage, your power wall feeding into your electric sort of autonomous vehicle here. And of course, California making solar roofs now standard in all new construction. And there's all sorts of new ways of thinking about living arrangements as well and how we can move beyond the single family home to adopt this to other types. The most decorated building in the United Kingdom last year that won the Reba Sterling Prize was this public housing project, council estate housing called Goldsmith Street in Norwich. All of the housing you're looking at is made of brick. It's designed to passive house standards. It's incredibly energy efficient. It has electricity bills 30% lower than its neighbors. And is zero energy ready to mount solar panels on its roofs. And of course, it's surrounded by green space. It has parking at the edges and was designed by working directly with architects versus a developer. So they were able to get lower construction costs on behalf of the city. These are some of the new kinds of models that we're seeing in Europe and elsewhere, co-housing of things that I think can easily be combined with all sorts of new technologies like blockchain. To imagine, for example, neighborhood power microgrids that basically share electricity back and forth depending on who has it stored and did it so at what time of day kind of thing. New forms of basically sort of communal living there. And as a final note on this is one thing, again, the pandemic has shown is that, in addition to the private and public sectors, we've seen a renewed interest in sort of community of citizens by necessity having to resort to themselves. Some of you may know or may work in mutual aid groups. This, of course, has been the flowering of thousands of organizations to basically organize on group texts and over Slack and Google Docs to get groceries for neighbors and carry out such tasks. This traditionally has happened in the last 50 years during disasters. The most famous and largest was Occupy Sandy in New York. 60,000 volunteers mobilized to basically create ad hoc processing centers. And again, you may have seen flyers like this. This is one here in Montreal about organizing local communities. Again, bringing technology to bear, and this is potentially powerful. Jen Palka, who founded Code for America, who was a deputy CTO of the United States, she and 4 other deputies created a new organization called U.S. Digital Response, which is creating these tools on behalf of cities. This is one called Neighbor Express to create these kinds of mutual aid software networks. They've also created one called Storefront, again, taking all that in retail and turning it into community spaces to provide services. So I think we're going to see this really interesting blend between the community and government and private sector being done by necessity. Three more thoughts on this. Here in Montreal, they actually created a delivery platform for restaurants owned by the city to do these deliveries at cost. So new kinds of municipal services and architecture. And I mentioned, blockchain. This is a co-working space in Minneapolis that a friend of mine runs, where ownership is actually run on the blockchain. So you can contribute financially or through tasks and deeds and giving back to the community there, and the ownership and decision structures change in real time. So we're going to start to see, I think, some flourishings here of like how we actually run these organizations as well. And then as a final look into the future, there's a great organization called Happy City in the UK. And, they've actually proposed the question about universal basic, thinking about through new neighborhood libraries, new kinds of communal infrastructure, new kinds of commons that might emerge here to basically help people in the next pandemic or the next crisis that strikes. So thinking through what that might be. So we have a few minutes left here. We'll do our last poll and we'll squeeze in some more questions we haven't gotten to. So this will see how dystopian you're feeling. The next decade in climate change will bring an even deadlier pandemic, a $1 trillion natural disaster. This was advanced by John Seo, the founder of the Catastrophe Bond, who imagined that a Category 5 hurricane strike on Lower Manhattan or the big one in Tokyo would be the first $1 trillion payout in the insurance industry history. Solar too cheap to meter, an abundance scenario where we have a breakthrough in renewables that starts to change everything, or nothing because climate change is a hoax held by a non-insignificant portion of the American electorate. Let's see, new questions up here. Do you think the current legislative process in the United States can or even should keep pace with the issues accompanying all innovation, or do you think a fundamental shift in how government responds to these things is inevitable? By John Baxley. Well, I would put myself, since we just had this discussion, I'm a big believer in the Green New Deal, as you want an example of this. And I do think there should be government capacity to execute these kinds of changes and do so in a scale that commensurate to them. That said, I'm also kind of a believer in what's been described in the United States is sort of a post-developed society, in the sense of, that we can't build anything anymore, that all sorts of small-scale, corruption, small C corruption, and other sorts of inefficient processes make it impossible to build. And we've seen this, the huge cost to expand the New York City subway system, for example, or even fix it, or what, California effectively abandoning high-speed rail because of cost overruns is a very worrying trend. That said, the panacea for that, public-private partnerships, often, it's all in how those are structured, and there are more bad ones than good ones. The famous example for how Chicago giving away its parking meters, for 60 years effectively. So it'll be interesting to see. Here's the question. The next decade will bring a $1 trillion natural disaster. You guys are a dystopian bunch here. Over half believe that we will see another massively disruptive event there. Well, good. Since you chose that one, I'll tell you a brief story before we do a few more questions. When I imagined for my team here on sort of how we would get to all that coastal, housing in 2067, what I imagined is the next U.S. financial crash would actually be triggered by such a disaster. Hurricane Hermine in 2022 is the $1 trillion storm that destroys Lower Manhattan, bankrupting the states of New York and New Jersey. Governors Cuomo and John Bon Jovi agree to basically sell off the Port Authority to pay for it, which leads to the Singaporeans buying it, and it triggers the crash of 23. Which basically, is America's financial system waking up to all of that buried systemic financial risk in their balance sheets, much like they discovered, mortgage swaps in the financial crisis. And that, of course, leads to, in our scenario written in 2017, President Trump dying in office from the stress to be replaced by President Mark Zuckerberg in 2024. So we shall see what the outcome of 2 weeks from now brings, if that turns out to be true. So I'm sorry, a few of you missed the poll questions here. So I guess you'll have to see. So I think your answers to choose from are very inadequate. Well, there's, of course, gross, many other things we can choose from. But we'll do some more questions here first. Let's see. I'm going to scroll through. We had some problems with the poll. How will workers' compensation insurance have to change? I think that's an excellent question, going back to some of our discussions about gig work as well. Yeah, I do think that there needs to be sort of a new sort of fair deal for American workers, and thinking through what these structures might look like. Obviously we build social safety nets at various times, thinking through one that would design how to offer protections to employees, but also allow them to have things like portable 401ks, which has been, mooted by, for example, the co-founder of TaskRabbit is working on a startup about that. There's a lot of opportunities there, I think, to design both public protections for gig workers and also, private opportunities there to help them sort of carry through their finances. As many of you know, I was a freelancer for 15 years, and as many of you may know, our current system is very much weighted towards permanent employment and is very suspicious of those who are independently employed. So I do think there's a lot of opportunities there to remove that bias and actually build those structures. Let's see. Do you see the potential applications of AI hitting a cap or ceiling as our capacity to track and measure the data we would need to feed into these systems is still nascent? By John Baxley. Yeah, I mean, there's an entire thing about this about, and this has come up during the pandemic. This is another example of this where, luminaries in this field like Kai-Fu Lee have actually graded the performance of AI systems as quite low because AIs need training models, and there was no training model for a pandemic like this. So I do think, yeah, I mean, basically, what we've seen is machine learning in particular is only as good as the data sets you feed it on. And, when it comes to truly disruptive events like this, they're not very good at all. They're very good at maintaining efficiencies and mining that through. So, yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what kind of hard limits we hit in our ability to cleanse and understand these data sets. So let's see. I don't know if we can go over here. I'll let Gerald cut me off in a moment. But at least to get to one here. Can you talk about how California is planning to follow the... Great. I'll get Vanessa's last question here about how California is planning to follow the government executive order to be all electric. How will this impact us automakers, et cetera? The interesting thing about that is I think that's actually a hollow order. I think by 2030, none of us will be buying internal combustion engine cars. I don't think it'll be necessary to forbid those sales by 2035 because I think they'll be non-competitive by then. Based on what we're seeing, Tesla obviously just posted another gangbuster quarter. We're really starting to see European automakers rev up on this, and of course China is going to lead the way on this with the world's only healthy functioning economy right now and huge subsidies for that because of their own interest in air quality. So yeah, I think, that now is the time to really embrace electric as well. And I think that basically if the United States doesn't, if the Trump administration trend to loosen emission standards continues, we're going to see a bizarre bifurcation where America will become the sort of rump market where everyone else will be building cars for a global electric market. And, the OEMs will be trying to figure out, do we design cars and SUVs that are very profitable, but we can only sell in America because they're outlawed everywhere else? That's going to be, I think, the big dilemma for them going forward. So with that, thank you all so much for listening. I hope I answered many of your questions, and I will hand the floor back to Elaine and Joe.
Thank you very much for the presentation today, Greg. This is the first entry, of course, of our virtual 2020 Building Opportunity Conference. For more information on Greg's presentation today, as well as our further topics coming across on the next couple of weeks, please visit the resources widget here on On24, as well as the Building Opportunity Conference webpage at mossadams.com. In a few moments, a webcast survey will be launched within your browser window. Please feel free to fill that out so we can grab your feedback. And we look forward to seeing you at the next installment for this conference series. Thank you very much, everybody.